personal tribute, I now yield to the Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer.
The gentlelady from Michigan, I thank her for yielding. And the Speaker Pro Tem, Ms. Jacobs. How proud Madeleine Albright would be of the two of you standing here, presiding here, and giving tribute to an extraordinary woman who must have been, particularly for women, she was for me as well, but particularly for women, an extraordinary example of success, of focus, of intellect, of achievement. And I thank the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Slatkin, for taking this special order. And Madam Speaker, tomorrow, as the Speaker just said, at the National Cathedral, really the cathedral, the America's cathedral, many of us will gather to remember and celebrate the extraordinary life of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright was a dear and valued friend for over 35 years. As the chair of the Helsinki Commission, I worked closely with her on issues related to human rights and foreign affairs for years, for a decade that I was chair. Secretary Albright was a diplomat, a teacher, and a mentor to so many who now serve in our diplomatic corps and in the world of foreign policy. She was an author who used her pen and her voice to urge us both to see the untapped possibilities in our world and not to ignore the dangers that confronted our country, our freedom, and our democracy. Perhaps most of all, Secretary Albright was someone who never forgot the experience of being a refugee and a survivor of war and genocide. It gave her great insight and determination to confront the enemies of freedom and human rights. Her family fled Czechoslovakia when it fell under the oppression of Nazi occupation. Her determination was spurred as well when Czechoslovakia fell under Stalin's heel. That experience pushed her to spend her life working to keep others safe from those evils and to ensure that the world's democracies, led by America, took action to help those fleeing conflict and danger. In 2018, she released a masterful book that everyone ought to read, Fascism, A Warning. She said in that book, throughout his time in office, she wrote of Vladimir Putin, he has stockpiled power at the expense of provincial governors, the legislature, the courts, the private sector, and the press. A suspicious number of those who have found fault with him have later been jailed on dubious charges or murdered in circumstances never explained. She saw then very clearly the threats that he and others pose to democracy in our time. I miss her wise words. Luckily, she wrote a lot of them down, and those were some that we certainly ought to remember. Those insights, as Ukrainians' brave fighters battle a new tyranny and another criminal dictator. After she died, just days following Vladimir Putin's criminal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, whom the Speaker just mentioned, said, and I quote, "As has happened so often, the man with the guns was wrong and Madeleine was right." Right now, as the world confronts Putin's aggression, as we and our fellow democracies stand up to authoritarianism and tyranny, we do so better prepared, Madam Speaker, because of the warning and lessons that Secretary Albright gave us. In many ways, the most fitting tribute to her memory is the unity we and our allies are demonstrating in the face of Putin's threat to democracy, decency, and international law. Before Secretary Albright's death, President Biden had committed $424 million toward his presidential initiative for democratic renewal, which drew heavily on Secretary Albright's proposals and which sought to tackle the challenges she identified in her book, fascism a warning. It is easier, she wrote, to remove tyrants and destroy concentration camps than to kill the ideas that gave them birth. This is a war of ideas, and America must lead the fight for democracy. Now, Secretary Albright's legacy is felt throughout the global alliance of our democratic allies and partners confronting Vladimir Putin and Russia together, where billions of dollars in both military and humanitarian assistance are being mustered and deployed in defense of democracy and human rights, the cause for which she lived and of which she spoke so eloquently. After Secretary Albright died, I spoke at length with my foreign policy advisor, Mariah Sixkiller, who was the part of the group that met at Secretary Albright's home for 15 years for discussions about American leadership around the world. I asked Mariah to just write a few words of her recollections. She told me, quote, "I was honored to be at her table for 15 years and to learn from this great stateswoman. She was, as the gentlelady from Michigan has pointed out, witty, wise, bold, and brilliant, even unto her final days. Even, as the gentlelady from Michigan said, someone as old as 80. She went on to say, Mariah Sixkiller, she had the perfect combination of good humor and unique charm. Our speaker just reflected that, as the lady from Michigan did. She made us laugh even at the hardest times. All of us who knew her and who worked with her during her time in government remember that characteristics, wit and charm, along with her keen intellect and her vision of a more perfect union and more perfect, peaceful world. Madam Speaker, I particularly admired the dedication she had to the mission of standing up for the rights of women and girls worldwide. As the first woman to serve as Secretary of State, a successor to Thomas Jefferson and so many other extraordinary leaders who have served in that post, including, of course, Secretary Clinton. At a time when women were still having to prove they belonged in boardrooms and around cabinet tables dominated by men, she felt a unique responsibility to be a voice for girls and women striving to be all they could be, undefined by gender alone. And she was that voice. She knew that when women have more political, social, and economic freedom, societies are better off in every way. Democracies, she believed, are stronger, and democratization is more successful when women and girls can pursue opportunities in safety, equality, and freedom. The fight for women's rights never ended for her. Even as recently as just a few months ago, Secretary Albright was working furiously to push for more action to help women and girls in Afghanistan. We left Afghanistan with the hopes that there would be some civilized action by the Taliban. Sadly, we have seen that they returned to their old ways of discrimination and putting down and disallowing young women to go to school, to prepare themselves for leadership. She was active, and as a matter of fact, the leader of the National Democratic Institute, which she chaired, which argued strenuously for the rights of those girls and those women. That was the last time we spoke directly, as we worked together to help save these courageous Afghans who dedicated themselves to the goal of creating a democratic future in their country. In the final months of her life, Secretary Albright wrote down some reflections to be included in a new memoir. Discussing what she perceived to be her own shortcomings, she shared this: "My parents taught me what the best teachers tell us all, that it is no sin to make a mistake, but unpardonable not to try to make the most of our talents." Fortunately for America and people around the globe, Madam Speaker, Secretary Albright made the most of the many, the legion of talents which she had and with which she was gifted. One of the greatest was as a teacher. As the speaker said, she was a teacher for 40 years. And I would correct the speaker in saying she was a teacher for at least 60 plus years. Although probably prior to 20, she was a teacher as well. She taught thousands of students over the course of an almost 40-year career in academia. As a professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, Secretary Albright helped train and launch the careers of so many who are leaders today for America's foreign policy and national security. That is why so many of us are going to honor her tomorrow, and we will not forget ever what she contributed to this country. A perfect example of how important it is to accept and have come to this country the brightest minds, the most committed people. What an extraordinary example of she was of the enrichment that immigration has given to this country. Moreover, she had an unwavering belief that women in the field of foreign policy must support each other. Mariah, you didn't give that quote, and I know Mariah is listening right now, but Mariah Sixkiller was my national security advisor, and she worked with me, and very frankly, Mariah knew what I believed before I believed it. She was extraordinary. Moreover, the inspiration that she gave to Mariah is still fired up in her eyes, in her speech, and in her thinking. She served as a mentor to scores of other young women who were students as well as her colleagues at the State Department. And she strove to ensure that these women got a seat at the table. Secretary Albright's legacy will live through these women who have followed in her footsteps and become the Foreign Service officers, ambassadors, working hard on behalf of the American people today and for a long time to come. Madam Speaker, we are so fortunate to have their talents in service to our country as a result of her example and advocacy. And I again repeat, as I'm sure she's watching, she is so proud, I hope, of our friendship, but so proud of Congressman Slotkin, so proud of Congresswoman Jacobs, as they rise on her behalf as leaders of this country. Tomorrow, we will bid Secretary Albright farewell. But our country and its leaders would be wise to keep her close in our hearts and in our minds in the weeks and months and years ahead. In many ways, the battle underway between democracy and despotism is one that Secretary Albright so presciently foresaw. That battle, which currently rages in Ukraine, reminds us, as she did, that the price of liberty is, in fact, eternal vigilance. We face a tortuous road ahead, one that will demand our energy, our faith, our perseverance, and our courage, all of which Secretary Albright displayed throughout her life. She believed that democracy would surely prevail, but she knew that that result required our constant attention. And when democracy prevails, as surely it must, it will be in no small part due to her work, her contributions, and her service. God blessed America with an extraordinary woman whose name was Madeleine Albright. And that name will be remembered for a long, long time to come. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Leader,